This is our ultimate Shadow Systems build. Oh wait. Now this is our ultimate Shadow Systems build. This might look like your standard Shadow Systems build, but you'll notice something. We actually are running an integrated compensator on this slide. You can't do this with a standard Glock 19 and 17. This is specifically special to Shadow Systems. So when we deep dive into what this is, you can buy an XR920 slide and throw it on a DR920 frame, and bam, you have this custom integrated build like you would see with the standard SIG P320. This might look like your standard Shadow Systems, but it has something a little bit different about it. For those that don't know, the XR920 uses a Glock 19 slide length, which has a barrel length of 4 inches and is sitting on a DR920 frame, which uses the Glock 17 length, which is a 4.5-inch barrel length. So what you get is that difference of a 1/2 inch, which is bridged by the Herrington Arms HG9XL compensator on there that gives it an integrated look. This is very common amongst the 320 builds that we do at Herrington Arms, but typically you can't do this with a Glock because the frame rails will not let a 19 slide go on a 17 frame. In my opinion, this is the best looking Glock clone build or integrated Glock build you could possibly do. Not only does the Shadow Systems do a really good job of an awesome aesthetic, but you have the compensator on here to give it that integrated look. And in my opinion, if you're not a fan of the 320, you're really not going to get a better aesthetic for a Glock style handgun. But one of the really unique features of Shadow Systems is going to be the slide. So let's deep dive into this slide. On top, we have a Holosun 508T. We use this stock quite a lot, but one thing I noticed about the optics system is it's very different from a lot of other manufacturers. They only provided an optics plate cover with 2 screws. They did not offer plates. Since this is a plateless system, I would have liked to seen some more screws come with this handgun so that we can mount a couple of kinds of optics. Other than that, I think it is a really cool system. Not having to use these plates increases your thread engagement, so you're gonna get a lot more thread into a solid piece of steel rather than just an 1/8 inch of thread engagement into an aluminum or steel plate. So it is a better system. Another thing I noticed is there's no post on here. So all of the recoil stress is going right into those 2 screws. This is a rather controversial thing that we see amongst the entire industry. Just wanted to make you guys aware that that is the system they are using. They are running really nice night vision backup iron sights with a yellow front dot that looks like it has tritium in it. I like this quite a lot. It is actually a really good backup iron sights if you are running an optic as well. One of the more notable features of this slide is actually going to be the slide serrations and the aesthetic. I really like what they did with all the cuts on this slide. I'm usually not one that is for the cuts that go all the way through to your barrel, just because it lets you get lint and debris in there when you conceal carry it. However, they did a really good job with this. I think it's really aesthetically pleasing. It's really cool. You can see their gold colored barrel through the cuts. So while I'm not usually for this, I think it does look pretty awesome. And then in the front, they did a really nice job of making the slide serrations look good rather than just some vertical lines like the standard Glock 19. They threw some angles in here. Very easy to press check this slide. It's not so coarse that it hurts your hands when you do have to manipulate it. And then on top, they even threw some on there, some very aggressive cuts to further give you some more grip when you have to manipulate your slide. And then on the back, again, really nice slide cuts. For me, if I have to manipulate the slide, I usually go in the front. So it is nice that it has these big ridges on the front. And then in the back, if I have to do it, I usually just grab the optic. So with that being said, I think this is one of the better looking aftermarket Glock slides that just happen to be their own manufacturer. For those that don't know the story behind Shadow Systems, they actually got started by machining slides for a Glock, and then they grew into their own company making firearms. It's a really cool and unique story, and in my opinion, I think they're one of the best Glock clones out there. And the reason I say Glock clone is this is kind of based on a Gen 3 Glock with a couple Gen 4 and 5 parts, which we'll get into later. One of those actually being the recoil assembly. You'll see on this DR920, it is actually using the same size recoil assembly as a Gen 4 or 5 Glock 19, whereas a standard Gen 3 Glock clone is going to use a Gen 3 recoil assembly. This is one of the reasons why we are able to use the Herrington Arms HG9XL. This compensator is made for Gen 4 and 5 and will not work for Gen 3. However, with Shadow Systems using that Gen 4 and 5 recoil assembly, with this slide using that system, we can throw this compensator on here, which is really nice. And as we go throughout this handgun, I will point out some of the features for the Gen 3, 4, and 5 styling they used on here and why I think it's one of the better Glock clones on the market. Another thing to keep in mind with compensators is if you take this XR920 slide off and put it back on the XR920 frame, the Herrington Arms HG9C is a great option if you're looking for a more Roland special style compensator. And of course you can use the HD9XL on there as well, but I think the HD9C is a great option. And in my opinion, it's one of the better looking compensators you can throw on these slides if you're not gonna do an integrated build like this. Another thing that's really unique about this slide assembly is gonna be the barrel from Shadow Systems. It has this really nice fluting. I love this bronze FDE gold color. It's very unique to Shadow Systems. I actually think they invented this color specifically for their brand, and it's worked really well for them. A lot of people are interested in this color. It's one of those eye-catching elements when you see a giant black gun and there's just a little bit of tasteful gold bronze in there. I think it really adds something to the build. Not only that, but they have some really nice cuts on here. It looks really professional. Once we go through this entire build, we'll do a price breakdown, so you guys will have all that information later. If you guys want to see that information now, there are going to be chapters throughout here and you can skip to the pricing, but I definitely recommend looking over this entire build because I will be adding my thoughts on each element as we go through it. If you guys ever want to try any of the accessories we use in our videos, like compensators, magwells, or extensions, Herrington Arms is going to have a 30% off Black Friday weekend. Starting November 29th, you can buy anything on our website for 30% off. So if you're on the fence about trying some of our gear, now would be the time to buy it at a really big discount. This is going to be the biggest discount of the year, so if you're interested, go check out HarringtonArms.com. So now let's jump into this DR920 frame. For those that don't know, this is essentially a Glock 17 frame. So it does hold a 17 round magazine, and it is a little bit longer than your standard Glock 19. Shadow Systems does use a lot of Gen 3 components here, including the takedown lever that you see on most Glocks, the slide release, and most of the internals. What they did opt to change from Gen 3 is going to be the mag release. This very much resembles a Gen 5 mag release, but it's much more polished. And in my opinion, they did a way better job than Glock did with their Gen 5 mag release. With this, it's gonna be a lot more tactile. You can hear that click. It just sounds a lot better than you would hear with a standard Glock. It just sounds deadened on the Glock. It's not as tactile. Shadow Systems sounds really nice. Not only does it sound nice, but it feels a lot nicer when you perform a reload than it does with the standard Glock. And the button is actually slightly flattened and rounded on the front, whereas the Glock is much more square and pointed off. And all it does is kind of hurt your finger. It really doesn't do anything for the tactileness of the reload or aid in the reload in any way. Shadow Systems mag release is pretty much spot on. And in my opinion, it has better texturing. It is more coarse. It has these deep gouges in it, whereas the Glock has these micro cuts that really just don't do anything. The trigger on this gun is infinitely better, in my opinion, than a stock Glock, Gen 1 through 5. This trigger, there's not a lot of take up. It's a little bit stiffer of a take up than Glock. And then it has a very tactile rolling brake that is relatively short. The reset is also very tactile. It pushes your finger forward nicely. It's definitely one of the better Glock triggers on the market, and I think they did quite a lot to this Gen 3 system to get it to feel this good. When you look at a Gen 5 Glock, the take up is a little bit softer, and when you pull the trigger, it is a much less refined rolling brake. You can feel it's not nearly as polished. The reset spring is not nearly as aggressive, pushing your finger forward, and it's not as tactile on the reset. For somebody who likes a very tactile, clicky trigger, this does a very nice job. Another thing I noticed is the safety. This flat safety is much better over the stock Glock. The stock Glock has this little line of a safety. On the Gen 5, there's no serrations on the actual trigger shoe itself. It is smooth. And this safety protrudes out the face of the trigger, which after shooting a lot, it gets kind of uncomfortable. When you pull the trigger, all you feel is that safety digging into your finger. However, when you pull the trigger on the Shadow Systems, you feel the presence of the safety, and it is slightly protruding, but it's flat and it's wider. It's a nice reference point for new shooters that go to pull the trigger and they know exactly where they need to put their finger on the trigger each time. Kind of like the Glock does, but it's just executed way better. Another thing to note about this trigger is I haven't found that it makes me shoot any faster than a stock Glock trigger. So while it feels a lot better in a lot of ways, I haven't really seen any performance benefits or differences between the two triggers. One thing I've noticed with this whole trigger area is there's a deeper undercut underneath of the trigger, which allows you to get your hand up on the gun better than the stock Glock. The stock Glock pushes your middle finger down. It's very pronounced, it's very noticeable. Whereas with the Shadow Systems, it feels like it was cut perfectly for your hand, which is gonna allow you to shoot a lot more comfortable. You're not gonna have pain points in your hands or fingers when shooting the Shadow Systems compared to really any stock Glock. Talking about the ergonomics, I think the Shadow Systems did a really nice job on all their frames, including the DR920. This gun feels very similar to a Glock frame. It is the same profile. If I were to pick up both guns side by side, the profile feels identical, but the Shadow Systems has a different backstrap system in here that is much better than the stock Glock one. You can pull these inserts out and replace them with smaller or bigger inserts. Whereas the Glock frame, all you do is add more plastic on the back, and it really is just a bad system. Another thing you're gonna notice with the ergonomics of these shadow systems, they have this really nice ledge here for your support thumb. There's a great amount of texture on there. They did this pretty much perfect in my opinion. This ledge is gonna allow you to fight that recoil and give your support thumb a great place to go. And if you're a newer shooter and you're used to keeping your finger off the trigger, on the other side, there's a great place for your finger to go. And or if you're a lefty, they also thought of you and they give you a ledge on that side. Talking about lefties, with this being a premium, more expensive handgun, I would have liked to seen an ambi mag release on here. However, I'm not sure what the engineering involved would be to get a Glock clone to have an ambi mag release. Just something I would like to see going forward. Another thing you're gonna really notice with the shadow systems is gonna be that beaver tail. It just sweeps out much farther than the stock Glock, allowing you to comfortably get your hand as high on the gun as you possibly can. Obviously, a lot of people have this issue. Slide bite is a huge thing with a lot of people. Getting high on the gun and controlling the gun is really important for recoil. So a lot of times people's hands will get up there real high and they'll get slide bite on the back of their thumb. This has never been an issue for me, but I do like the idea of having this big beaver tail because what it's gonna do is act as a leverage point. As you shoot, that beaver tail is gonna dig into your hand here and stop some of that muzzle flip. When shooting this gun, we did a lot of shooting with 124 grain, which if you know anything about compensators, 115 is gonna shoot the flattest. But in my opinion, this gun was still very comfortable to shoot, and I really liked all the forethought they have with fighting recoil, both on this little ledge here and this extended beaver tail. One thing I did notice about the shadow systems is the polymer is harder, which kind of makes it feel a little bit cheap until you grab the Glock. In my opinion, the Glock's soft plastic feels much cheaper than the shadow systems. Both plastic feel relatively cheap, but that's kind of the stigma around plastic, is it feels rather cheap. So I'm glad they went with a harder plastic on this frame. And with that, I think they accomplished a much better grip texture. This grip texture is honestly phenomenal. I feel like it'd be a little bit aggressive for concealed carry and it might hurt your stomach a little bit. But with that being said, it is rather aggressive and very planted when you're shooting. This gun does not really want to move around very much when you're shooting. And there's grip texture all around it, which I really like, including, like I said, on the thumb rest. So I think they did a really nice job with the plastic and the grip texture on this handgun. So now for the accessories on this build, we have a Surefire X300 Turbo on here. I opted to throw this on here to help reduce some of that recoil with some more weight. And I really like the aesthetic of it sticking out past the compensator on this build. I think it really gave it a wholesome look. And if you're wanting to save a little bit of money on this build specifically, the TLR1 HL would perform very similarly. We've actually done a video on that if you guys want to check that out. However, I think the TLR1 is a great option. It's just going to be a little bit shorter and it would honestly fall closer to flush with the end of the compensator rather than extending past. And for this build, I just opted to choose something a little bit longer. The Turbo is a great weapon light. My biggest complaint with it is actually the switch. It is a little bit too hard to engage this switch, especially if you get into a sticky situation. To engage it, it just feels like it's too hard. It's not very tactile. It's kind of mushy. With the TLR1, it is a very light and tactile flick. That is one of the biggest reasons why I like the TLR1. The switches, in my opinion, are just superior to the Surefire X300. However, this is a great weapon light with a lot of output. In my opinion, the Turbo is a way better option than a standard X300 just because of the candela. Again, if you guys want to see more information about weapon lights, I definitely recommend checking out that video. Last but not least, on the frame, we are going to have the magwell. For $19, you seriously cannot beat this. This magwell is phenomenal, and there's really not too much I honestly would change on it, other than probably making it out of aluminum, which again would just increase the cost. So for $19, you're really not gonna get much better than this. The funnel is phenomenally big. It is very aggressive, but the magwell itself is not obscenely big. If you decided to carry this gun, the flare on the side is not super big that you would actually start printing, but the front is extended out to help keep your hand planted on the frame. You can see my hand falls a little bit short of getting pressed up, but if I find that I don't get a proper grip or that my hand settles a little bit lower, it rests on that magwell, doing a really nice job. And I really like the mounting system. I think this has a really rock solid mounting solution. It was very well engineered, so good on Shadow Systems for that one. And with the Shadow Systems, you also get two 17-round Magpul PMags. I've been open about my dislike for these mags. In a stock Glock, they just do not want to fall out of the gun as fast as a standard Glock mag does. It just feels like it ejects better. However, in the Shadow Systems, I feel like they opened up this magwell area a little bit to specifically be designed for the PMag, and it drops out really clean, really positive. I'd like to see Shadow Systems make their own mag out of potentially steel, just because I prefer steel magazines. When I'm carrying, if I'm not running a full appendix setup and I'm running an off-body bag setup, I do like carrying a Neo Mag, and with these mags, there's no metal in here, so I can't use a Neo Mag, and it's just flopping around in my pocket, or it's in the bag flopping around. So for me, that's why I've never been a big fan of these, but I'm glad that Shadow Systems did give you 2 mags, and obviously they can't just give you a Glock mag. That'd probably be impeding on Glock's trademark or patents somewhere in there. So I'm glad they at least give you 2 magazines, even though they're not my favorite mags. One thing I did notice when shooting this is I did not get slide lock every time. With all Glocks, I ride this slide release a lot, and it was no difference for the Shadow Systems. So one thing I am thinking about doing is throwing a Cogworks slide release on here to get it up out of the way, so when I'm shooting, I do get slide lock to really help with those reloads. You'll see in some of the shooting footage, I did fail to get slide lock. So this is one of the Glock problems coming over into the Shadow Systems. Talking about reloading, I had virtually no issues with reloading with this magwell. Like I mentioned, it is a really big funnel, and this magwell is pretty much perfectly set up for this Magpul PMag. So how much does this build cost? What we did is we bought an XR920 and a DR920, and we just swapped slides. You'll see the DR920 here is on this XR920 frame. In my opinion, I've never been a fan of the longer slides on shorter frames. Really, the reason we did this is so that we had 2 different guns, so that we could play with the 2 very popular Shadow Systems guns, and ended up building this really awesome build. So if you were to build it out like that, here's what the prices are. For the DR920, you're looking at $739. Again, I think this is very fair for what you get out of the Shadow Systems. The magwell is $18.87. The Holosun 508T is $435. I think if you wanted to cheapen up this build, you could go with a cheaper Holosun, like the Holosun 407K. It will save you around $200 specifically on just this one item. The Surefire X300 Turbo for $379. Again, if you put a TLR1 on here, you're gonna save another $200. Which will save you $400 on this entire build. The Herrington Arms HG9XL cost $89. When it comes to the final price of this build, the XR920 cost $989. The DR920 cost $679, which brings the total to $2,591. I would really like to see Shadow Systems offer the XR920 slide separate by itself. That way you could not have to buy 2 handguns, which for this build, having to buy 2 handguns, I think that's a very fair price, and it's very in line with our ultimate P320 build, which I believe was between $2,200 and $2,500, so very fair, and you get 2 handguns out of it. I have found a couple MR920 Elite handguns with threaded barrels for cheaper than $989, so if you do want to buy 2 guns and build 1 ultimate, you can make this build a little bit cheaper than $2,500. Both guns perform really well, and in my opinion, they're an elite level build. Not only do they look phenomenal, but they perform really great as well. So what do you get for $2,400? What is the shooting experience like? This gun shot great. We shot a lot of 124 grain ammo through it. We had no malfunctions. It feels very planted in the hand. The ergonomics are phenomenal. I would have no problem carrying this handgun, which is going to be a little bit off-putting to a lot of people that are used to carrying subcompact handguns, but we'll probably throw this in my carry rotation. It's not obscenely heavy. It feels very premium. And this is one of those guns that I definitely put on a pedestal next to our 320. Not only does it look phenomenal, but it runs really great. If I'm going to build a Glock, from now on, it would probably be a Shadow Systems. Throwing all these parts on a Glock is great, but it's kind of like putting lipstick on a pig. It is still a very ugly, square, Tupperware feeling core. While I've been hating a lot on Glock, that's not to take away its reliability. This is a very reliable gun. It's just aesthetically doesn't do it for me like the Shadow Systems does. And with the Shadow Systems being a Glock clone, you kind of get the best of both worlds. You get the reliability and you get the aesthetic and you get the premium feel of a handgun, which is why I appreciate this gun so much. Not only do they have a really cool story and a really cool background, but they make a really great product. And all that kind of combines into a really great shooting experience. Not only does it feel great in the hand when shooting, but it also is incredibly accurate and shoots really soft, which are kind of the 2 more important things. Aesthetics is important, but at the core, you really just have to be comfortable with the handgun. The downfall is with the Glock aesthetics isn't as important as the feel, and I think the general feel of a Glock is a really good baseline for most shooters, and Shadow Systems just improved on that with the little bit better ergonomics, the better trigger, the better grip texture, and really you're not paying that much more for it. The baseline DR920 costs $740, whereas the stock Glock 19 MOS or Glock 45 MOS, you're looking at $620. So For $120 difference, you get a better trigger, better grip texture, better slide serrations, a much better feeling platform. While it is an older platform, it is the Gen 3 core, I still think there's not a huge difference between the Gen 3, 4, and 5. Really what it came down to is they were changing aesthetics. So for $120 more, you really get a lot out of the Shadow Systems and retain a lot of the core benefits of the Glock. And obviously it does use Glock mags, which is important if you own a lot of Glocks. And it is kind of unanimous across the United States. A lot of people have Glocks. So if you really like the idea of the Glock or some of the features of the Glock, but you don't like the aesthetic, I think the Shadow Systems is a great option. And if you're looking to do a build like you would with your Glock, you are not limited. Not only do you get more features, but you unlock the ability to throw a compensator and nest it in this frame. While you do sacrifice some of that customization that you could do with a Glock, with stippling and aftermarket slides, you already kind of make up for those features with a Shadow Systems already offering them to you. For $120 more, I think it's a great platform to start a build. Real quick, if you guys haven't noticed, I changed my hat. We have been filming for over a year with the exact same hat. We thought it was time that we wanted to offer you guys a really nice Herrington Arms hat. Go to harringtonarms.com and it'll be on the website. If you guys like this video and you want to see more content with the Shadow Systems, we would appreciate a like and subscribe. We'll see you next time.